This is the Lew Rockwell Show.
Well, how great to have as our guest this morning Mr. James Turk. James is the founder and chairman of GoldMoney.com. Since 1987, he's edited the investment newsletter Free Market Gold and Money Report. His most recent book is called The Collapse of the Dollar and How to Profit from It, Make a Fortune by Investing in Gold and Other Hard Assets. So, James, tell us, give us a synopsis of what the heck is happening to the economy, what the Fed and the federal government are doing to us, and what the individual might do to protect themselves to the extent possible.
Yeah. The basic problem that we all face here, Lou, is that there's just too much money printing going on. And, historically, governments have always turned to the printing press to try to solve their problems. And unfortunately, problems cannot be solved by printing more money. And I think that's something that we're starting to realize. And as a consequence, the gold price is going up. The values of tangible assets are going up. Inflation is rising because people are starting to understand that the dollar has some serious problems.
The dollar has serious problems, obviously, internationally as well as here domestically. They certainly have printed enough money to bring on hyperinflation, I guess, since, of course, what happens with prices is determined by people's subjective views of what's happening, so that in Weimar, prices didn't go up anywhere near as much as the money supply one might have thought would have dictated, then went up much faster than the money supply was going up as people realized what the heck was happening. Do you think people are beginning to realize, and are we actually facing hyperinflation, or is it going to be some kind of 70s again where it's, many years of high inflation but not super high inflation? What do you think?
Yeah, you're raising a good point about what happened in Weimar, Germany. My view is that we're on this path to what I call the fiat currency graveyard. No fiat currency backed by nothing except government promises, has ever existed, continue to exist. Eventually, they're all killed because of overissuance and a drop in confidence in the value of that currency, which is the point that you were making about Weimar. When it comes to money, we normally talk about the quantity of money, M1, M2, M3, but we tend to ignore the demand for money. But money, just like any other good and service, is a function of supply and demand. And when confidence in a paper currency or a fiat currency is lost, the demand can drop very, very rapidly. It's hard to say how high they would have to go, but we need higher interest rates to encourage savings because, savings is the backbone of capitalism. And right now, the middle class, which again is the backbone of capitalism because that's where most of the savings and production are in the economy, are getting killed by these lower interest rates. And it's really quite tragic, what is happening, because capital formation is a key element to economic growth and productivity. So the low interest rates are, an adverse policy to, in terms of ultimately solving this problem that we have, which is that there's just too much debt in the society, in the economy. And when you go through a boom and bust cycle, the Austrian trade cycle, you have the boom and you have the bust. During the boom, banks make too many loans, borrowers borrow too much money, and during the bust, those balance sheets of banks and borrowers have to be brought back into more prudent levels. So that debt has to be repaid or destroyed because of bankruptcies and things of that nature, and then you create the next opportunity for the next cycle. And by trying to solve a debt problem by putting on more debt, which is what policymakers are doing, not only in the United States, but around the world, they're not really solving the problem. They're just kicking the can down the road, and it's creating a bigger problem to try to resolve at some future date.
Interesting aspect of Keynes was his comment, which I think puts in a nutshell his whole attitude, that he wanted to bring about the euthanasia of the rentier, that is, the killing of people who lived off interest. He hated the guts of people who had saved and then were able to live off or gained in other ways, and then were able to live off interest payments. He hated them. And so he really, Keynes's legacy really has kicked in the teeth people who've been frugal, people who've saved all their lives. They can't live off the interest rate. They have to consume their principal to live.
Yeah, and that's really quite sad, because it's really the savings, again, that creates the productive element of the economy. If there is no savings, you're not going to have the money available for investment and growing and expanding economic activity.
Well, James Turk, here we are in the situation that the Fed and the federal government and all the crazies and those who aren't just pure evildoers, of course, in Washington, have put us in. And as you say, not only in the United States, but the whole Western world, following along like the train behind the the Federal Reserve locomotive. So it's Western Europe and everybody's in trouble. Let's say you're a middle-class person in this country. You listen to people like James Turk. You're very worried about what's going to happen. Are you just subject to being ripped off and wrecked and destroyed, or is there something you can do for yourself and your family?
Yeah, what you really have to do, Lew, is you have to focus on what's best for you and your family, and you have to prepare for the coming storm. You know, the Depression was a tough time, but if you'd prepared for it, you got through. It wasn't necessarily, easy to get through, but you did make it through the other side of the valley. And we've got another financial storm that's already started, with the collapse in 2008, and more is yet to come, and you have to prepare for it. And, there are a number of things to do, but generally speaking, during a bust like we've been going through, you want to avoid financial assets and own tangible assets that make sense. In terms of the liquid side of tangible assets, gold and silver is a form of money, and that makes sense, and they will probably continue to do well going forward. It's money that's not contingent upon someone's promise. There is no counterparty risk when you own a gold coin or a silver coin. Other types of tangible assets like farmland and timberland, that's real wealth, and that timberland is still going to be here on the other side of the valley. And that timberland will then be used to build, houses at some future date or whatever it happens to be used for, or farmland will continue to create food, throughout the economic difficulty. So I think that's basically the thing that, people have to do. They have to start focusing on what's best, for their own personal situation, and don't rely on government. And I think we have to go back to what made this country great in the first place, which was self-reliance, reliance on friends and family. Don't rely on government and government promises, because in effect, I think we have a financial Katrina coming. And just like the people who were not prepared for Katrina suffered by relying on promises of the government, I think going forward from here, this financial Katrina that's coming, if you're relying on promises of the government, I think you're going to be in a difficult situation.
Well, as Murray Rothbard said, if you'll understand libertarianism if you simply think of the government as a criminal band writ large. And so, absolutely, we shouldn't pay any attention. My view is we should always do the opposite of what they tell you to do.
I think that's a good strategy. And since you mentioned Rothbard's name, I think another thing that people can do is read some of Rothbard's work. I always recommend The Case for a 100% Dollar and, What has the Government Done to Our Money? 2 little pamphlets available from Mises.org. I think those are fantastic books, pamphlets that everybody should read to understand what money is all about. And, educating yourself in terms of preparing for what's coming, I think is an important step everybody should be looking to do.
No, absolutely. Both Mises and Rothbard argued that economics was far too important to be left to the economists, that every person had to know some economics to be able to understand what was going on. And of course, Murray Rothbard, such a great writer in addition to all his other achievements, and The Case for a 100% Gold Dollar, and especially What Has Government Done to Our Money, are indeed can be read by any intelligent layperson, beautifully written, fascinating, and you'll know far more about money than anybody in Washington except Ron Paul.
I agree with you completely on that one. Maybe we should send those booklets to all the policymakers and somehow get them to read it.
Well, if we can only get them to read it, right.
But, the interesting thing, Lew, is that at the state level, there's a lot going on. There are 12 to 15 states now that are looking at reestablishing gold and silver under Article 1, Section 10, under their constitutional powers, as an alternative to the U.S. dollar. So while I'm pessimistic about what's going on in Washington, I am optimistic about what's going on at the state level. Obviously state legislators have been reading Rothbard and Mises, while the policymakers in Washington have not. No,
absolutely. And I'll mention also Tom Woods' great book on nullification that talks about all the sorts of things that can be done at the state level and that were done by our ancestors to nullify illegitimate and unconstitutional federal laws like the Fugitive Slave Act by the state of Wisconsin before the Civil War.
Yeah, I agree. One of the beauties of the Constitution and the way the framers put it together was this balance of power between state and federal, checks and balances in a variety of different ways. And all we need to do is to have states reassert their constitutional powers, and particularly in an area of money, because money is central to society. If you have a bad money, you're going to have an unlevel playing field which favors the vested interests who can control, the rules of the game. And that's what we have with this Washington Wall Street access now, which arises because of the fiat currency that circulates in this country, which I should say is unconstitutional fiat currency, based on all of the analysis that was put together in Edwin Vieira's wonderful book, Pieces of Eight, which makes clear that we're on the wrong road, and we're on the wrong road because it's also unconstitutional and unconstitutional monetary system that we presently have.
Well, James Turk, thanks so much for coming on today. Thanks for what you do to help people have an umbrella for the coming storm. And we'll link, of course, to James's new book, to his website. And it's great to have you on the show, and appreciate very much your coming on.
Thank you very much, Lew.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Lew Rockwell Show.